The alien world spread wide under a crimson sky where jagged mountains cut the horizon, and the ground trembled from the movements of creatures that had ruled it for countless ages. The air smelled of iron and ash, and every sound carried the promise of danger. In this land nothing small or weak survived for long, and every living being carried scars of its struggle. Yet within this unforgiving place a young girl named Lyra found herself standing alone. Her skin shimmered faintly under the dying light of the sun, her body slim and fragile compared to the monstrous shapes that lurked behind the shadows. She had no weapons, left no companions to shield her, only the weight of fear in her chest, and the knowledge that her people had abandoned her. She tried to move quietly across the cracked soil, but each step seemed to echo against the silent rocks. Her heart pounded when she heard a low growl from the ridge above. Her kind had warned her all her life about the beasts of the wild. Nothing could have prepared her for the moment when glowing eyes locked upon her figure. From the ridge came a massive creature, its limbs thick with muscle and its fangs sharp like blades. Its skin was covered in dark scales that shimmered faintly under the light, as if nature itself had built armor for it. Lyra froze, her mind screaming at her to run, yet her body refused to obey. The creature leapt down and the ground shook upon impact. Its roar scattered the birds from the black trees nearby, and the sound made Lyra's bones tremble. She turned and fled, her feet carrying her across uneven ground. She stumbled on rocks, her hands scraped by thorns, yet still she pushed forward. Behind her the beast gave chase, every step closer than the last. She knew she could not outrun it. She knew that every second was borrowed, and that death was reaching for her with every beat of her heart. Her lungs burned as she stumbled into a clearing, but what she saw next only deepened her despair. Clearing was filled with more of them, 3 hulking shapes, each with eyes glowing bright in the dusk. Their heads turned as one, and they snarled, hunger flashing in their gaze. The world spun before her, and she felt her knees weaken. The thought came that this was how it ended, not with hope, not with rescue, only the way of the wild where the weak were swallowed and forgotten. But then she saw movement at the far edge of the clearing. A lone figure stepped out from behind the shattered remains of an ancient stone pillar, not an alien of her kind, not a beast, but a human. His shape was strange to her eyes, broad shoulders marked by armor patched together from scraps, his hands gripping a weapon unlike anything she had ever seen. It was long, metallic, dark, and humming faintly with energy. The beasts paused as if confused by this new arrival, and Lyra, too, stared, unable to believe that a human had wandered into this cursed place. Man did not run. He did not falter. His stance was firm. As he placed himself between Lyra and the advancing predators, his face was calm, though lines of struggle showed upon it. His eyes did not carry fear, but something she could not name, a fire that refused to bow to the world. The beasts snarled louder, circling ready to strike, and Lyra almost cried out for him to run to save himself. But he did not move away. Instead he raised the weapon and light flared from it with a sudden crackling sound. First beast lunged, but the human shifted aside faster than Lyra expected. The weapon struck and the beast fell back, wounded, its roar shaking the air. The others charged at once, and the ground became chaos. Lyra watched wide-eyed as the human fought. His movements were rough, not elegant, yet filled with determination. He rolled away from claws that dug into the earth, swung his weapon with both strength and cunning, and somehow each strike found its mark. He was no giant compared to the beasts, yet he fought as though he carried the strength of 10. Lyra had never seen her own people fight this way. Her kind avoided the wild, relying on walls and numbers. Humans, she had been told, were frail outsiders who did not belong in harsh worlds, yet here was one who stood alone in the clearing, holding back monsters that even her strongest warriors would have feared. The sound of battle filled her ears until she could hear nothing else. The clash of claws against metal, the roar of beasts, the crackling of energy through the weapon. Fear began to mix with wonder in her chest. She could not understand why this human had chosen to place himself in front of her. He owed her nothing. He did not even know her name, yet he risked himself against death itself. She clutched her arms to her chest, trembling, as she whispered to herself that perhaps hope had not been lost. Perhaps survival was not yet stolen from her. The fight dragged on, and the beasts circled, snarling, their bodies bleeding from wounds. Yet still they pressed forward, and still the human met them. Lyra realized with a sudden jolt that he was not simply fighting for himself. He fought to keep her alive. She had been ready to surrender to fate, but he had not. He had chosen to stand, and in that choice he had forced the beasts to pause, forced the world to change even for a moment. The clearing became a storm of violence and courage, and in the middle of it, Lyra understood one truth clear and sharp as the air in her lungs, that her death was no longer certain, that this human had altered everything with his presence, that in this cruel land where no mercy was given, something strange had entered the fight. Not strength alone, not skill alone, but a will that refused to break. And as the sun slipped lower, painting the sky in deeper crimson, the beasts roared again, circling with fury and hunger, and Lyra stood trembling behind the lone human who did not turn away. The beasts circled the clearing, their bodies low to the ground, their tails lashing against the earth, their glowing eyes fixed on the human who stood before them. The air was heavy with tension, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for the clash to begin again. Lyra pressed her back against the cold stone of a half-broken pillar, her body shaking and her mind caught between terror and disbelief. She had never seen anyone stand so fearlessly in front of such creatures, and every heartbeat reminded her that she was still alive only because of this stranger. The human shifted his stance, his weapon glowing faintly with energy. His breathing was steady, though sweat glistened across his brow. The beasts moved as one, two darting to the left, while the third sprang from the front. Their claws cut through the soil as they charged together. But the man did not back away. Instead he leapt forward, swinging his weapon with precision. A surge of light burst out, striking the beast on the left, sending it crashing to the ground with a cry of pain. The second beast struck from the right, its jaws snapping close to his arm, but he twisted and slammed the weapon against its side, forcing it to stagger back. The third was upon him instantly, massive jaws snapping shut inches from the shoulder. Yet somehow he managed to roll beneath its body and rise again before it turned its head to strike. Lyra gasped. She could hardly believe her eyes. Every move looked impossible against such monsters. But the human kept fighting. He did not seem unshakable. He bled from shallow cuts across his arm, and his breathing grew heavier, but his spirit did not falter. Each time the beasts lunged, he met them with strength and cunning. His feet moved quickly across the clearing, finding balance where she would have fallen. His arms struck again and again, fueled not only by skill but by willpower, as if surrender had never been a choice for him. Beasts drew back for a moment, snarling, their throats vibrating with anger. They were hurt but not defeated. Their eyes burned brighter as they spread out to trap him in a wide circle. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She could not stand still any longer. The instinct to hide screamed within her, but another voice whispered that she could not simply watch while someone else fought for her life. She picked up a sharp piece of stone from the ground, her fingers trembling as she held it. She knew it was useless against creatures with hides like armor, yet the act of holding it gave her strength. The man noticed her movement from the corner of his eye, but he did not tell her to stop. His gaze returned to the beasts, and his voice cut through the growls, low and steady. "You stay behind me," he said, not turning his head. She wanted to argue, but his tone carried a weight that made her obey. The beasts lunged together again, their claws flashing, and their bodies moving like shadows across the clearing. The human met them head-on, striking with his weapon in wide arcs of light. Sparks flew where metal met scale, and the sound of the fight echoed through the valley. Lyra found herself shouting, without realizing it, words of warning when one beast tried to circle behind him, cries of fear when another nearly caught his leg, and at last cries of hope when his strikes landed deep. She no longer felt like a helpless outsider, but part of the struggle, even if her role was only to call out the danger around him. She began to see the rhythm in his movements, the way he stepped forward, not backward, the way he forced the beasts to react. Instead of letting them control the fight, each strike was not random, but planned, forcing the creatures into hesitation. At last one beast faltered. Its body shuddered as the human struck it across the head, and it collapsed onto the ground trembling. Before it grew still, the other two roared louder anger, pushing them to reckless fury. They charged as one. But the human ducked low, spinning his weapon across the legs of the first, and driving his shoulder into the second. The clearing shook with the impact as the two monsters stumbled and collided with each other. Lyra's breath caught in her throat when she saw her chance. With all her strength, she hurled the stone at the nearest beast. It struck its eye, and though it did not wound the monster deeply, it forced it to turn its head away in pain. That single heartbeat gave the human the opening he needed. His weapon flared once more, and he struck with both hands, cutting across the throat of the beast, which fell to the ground with a choking cry. Only one remained. Its body towered above them, its scales torn and bleeding, its eyes full of rage. It stood between them and the forest behind. Its roar thundered across the valley, sending waves of fear into the air. Lyra stumbled back, but the human stepped forward one last time. His weapon hummed with a stronger glow, though the energy within it was fading. She saw his body sway with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with the same fire as before. The beast lunged faster than she thought possible, jaws wide enough to swallow him whole. But he dove aside and rolled to his feet, striking the creature's chest as it passed. The blow did not kill it, but slowed it enough for him to leap again, this time driving the weapon deep into its side. The beast screamed and thrashed the force, throwing the man to the ground. He struggled to rise, but his hand still clung to the weapon lodged within the beast. The monster writhed, twisting its body against the earth before it last it collapsed with a final roar. Its glowing eyes dimmed and silence returned to the clearing, broken only by the heavy sound of the man's breathing. Lyra could not move for a moment. Her body trembled with shock, and her mind tried to understand what she had just seen. The human pulled his weapon free and leaned upon it, his chest rising and falling, as if every breath was drawn from the edge of exhaustion. Slowly, she stepped forward. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "You fought them all. You saved me." He looked at her with tired eyes, but his mouth curved slightly into something between a smile and a grimace. "You are still alive," he said. "That is what matters." His words struck her deeper than she expected, for her people's survival was often a matter of numbers or chance, yet here was someone who had chosen to stand against death itself, not for his own sake alone, but for hers. The clearing was littered with the bodies of beasts, and the smell of blood hung heavy in the air. Yet in that moment, Lyra felt something she had not felt since before her exile, a fragile spark of hope. She looked at the man again, seeing not just a human, but a shield against the cruelty of the world. She whispered her thanks, though the words felt too small for what he had done. He said nothing more, only nodded and turned his gaze toward the darkening forest, where more dangers surely waited. And in that silence, Lyra understood that her journey had only begun, that survival was not yet guaranteed, that she had been given a chance, but the true test was still ahead. For now, though, she followed the human as he stepped forward into the shadows of the alien wild, knowing that something had changed forever. The forest rose around them, thick with twisted trees whose branches clawed at the sky like skeletal arms. The leaves were black and sharp, and they rustled with whispers carried by the night breeze. The ground was uneven, covered in roots that snaked like traps, waiting to catch the careless traveler. Lyra followed the human close behind her, steps quick, yet unsure. She had never ventured this deep into the wild, not even when she lived safely among her people. To be cast into it alone had been a sentence of death, and she knew that without him, she would already be gone. The man walked with steady purpose, though his shoulders slumped with fatigue. His weapon hung loosely in his grip, the glow dim but still alive. His breathing was heavy, yet controlled, each step chosen with care, as if he had crossed such terrain many times before he did not speak, and for a while Lyra wondered if he ever would. But silence could not hold her for long. The questions inside her pressed against her chest, until at last they spilled out. She asked him why he had saved her when he could have turned away. He paused for a moment before answering. His voice was rough but calm. "Because you were there, and you were alive," he said. That is reason enough. She did not understand. How could a human risk his life for someone he did not know? Her people had told her that humans were selfish, that they cared only for their own survival. Yet this man had thrown himself into the jaws of death without hesitation. She studied his face, though the dim light revealed little. His eyes, however, glowed faintly with determination, and she thought perhaps she was beginning to see that strange fire again. They moved deeper into the forest, and soon the sounds of movement echoed around them, distant growls, rustling branches, sharp cries from unseen creatures. Lyra's skin prickled with fear, but the man did not falter. He guided her along narrow paths, leading through thickets and over streams that glimmered faintly under the alien moonlight. Every so often, he would raise his hand signaling her to stop while he listened to the night. Then when he was sure the danger had passed, he would lead on without a word. It was a rhythm she began to trust at. Last they reached a small hollow between two massive roots that arched high above the ground. The man gestured for her to rest while he leaned against the trunk, his weapon across his knees. The silence pressed heavy, but this time Lyra chose to break it with softer words. She told him that her people had abandoned her, left her as prey for the beasts, because they believed survival was impossible. She whispered that she had accepted death until he appeared. She expected him to respond with pity or disbelief, but instead he shook his head slowly and said they were wrong. Survival is never impossible until you stop trying. His words sank deep into her heart, more powerful than she expected. She thought of the faces of her kin, cold and unyielding when they cast her away. She thought of the endless terror that had filled her since then. Yet now here was this man who told her that life was still hers to fight for. She looked down at her hands, trembling, but not with fear this time, rather with the realization that maybe she did not have to be powerless. The night grew colder and darker. The forest came alive with cries of unseen hunters, and the shadows pressed closer around their little hollow. Lyra could not sleep. Each noise sent shivers through her body. She turned her head and saw the human sitting still, his eyes scanning the darkness, never closing. His weariness was clear, but his focus never wavered. She wondered how long he had been living this way, fighting and moving through danger, with only his strength and his will to guide him. When the first light of morning broke through the branches, he rose again without complaint. He motioned for her to follow, and once more they pressed onward. The day did not bring safety in the distance. New growls rumbled, and strange winged shapes circled high above. Their claws gleamed in the sunlight, and their shrieks echoed across the valleys. The beasts of this world never rested, and she knew they would not escape them for long. By midday their fears proved true. They reached a stretch of open ground where the trees parted into rocky slopes. Suddenly the earth shook under heavy steps, and from the shadows emerged a pack of lean beasts, smaller than the giants of the clearing, yet faster and armed with sharp teeth. They fanned out to block the path, their growls vibrating through the stones. Lyra's heart leapt into her throat, and her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She knew they could not fight so many, not after the long night of struggle. The human raised his weapon, but its glow flickered weakly, as if the energy within was nearly gone. He tightened his grip, yet she saw the strain in his eyes. He knew as well as she did that his strength was not endless. Lyra swallowed her fear and stepped closer. She whispered that they must run, but he shook his head. His voice was calm. Even now, if we run, they will chase, and we will fall. They must believe we are stronger, or they will not stop. Before she could answer, the beasts charged. The human braced himself, weapon raised, yet his movements slower than before. He struck at the first beast to leap, but the second came from the side and nearly caught his arm. Lyra screamed, warning him, and he twisted just in time. Her cries became his guide, calling out each direction. As the beast circled, she felt her fear change into something sharper, not strength, but resolve. If he would not abandon her, then she would not stand useless. She picked up a heavy branch and swung it clumsily at a beast that came too close. Strike glanced off its snout, not enough to harm, but enough to distract, and once more the human found his opening. His weapon struck true, and the beast collapsed. The fight dragged on each moment, harder than the last. The human bled from new wounds, his body slowing under the weight of exhaustion. Yet he did not fall, and each time he looked ready to break. Lyra's voice reached in, carrying warnings, cries, and sometimes even desperate encouragement. At last, when the beasts realized their prey was not easy, they retreated, snarling into the trees. Their eyes glowed for a while longer before fading into the shadows. The silence that followed felt like a gift of breath after drowning. The human fell to one knee, his chest heaving. He forced himself upright, though his legs trembled, and wiped the blood from his arm. Lyra rushed to his side, her hands reaching out, though she did not know how to help. She whispered that he should rest, but he shook his head again, saying, "Not yet, not here. We keep moving." She wanted to protest, but something inside her had already changed. She no longer saw him as just a stranger, not even just as a human. He had become her anchor in the storm of this world, and without him, she would not take another step. As they walked once more through the endless wild, her fear was still there, yet it was joined by something new: trust. It was fragile but real, growing with every battle, every word, and every breath they shared in the shadows of the alien land. She did not know where their path would lead, only that she would not abandon it so long as he walked ahead. And somewhere deep in her chest, a thought stirred that this man had not only saved her life, he was teaching her how to fight for it. The sky darkened as storm. Clouds rolled across the horizon, and the forest grew silent in a way that made Lyra's skin crawl. Even the small creatures that normally cried from the branches had vanished, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. The human walked with slow steps, his eyes scanning every shadow, his weapon clutched in hands that trembled slightly from the long days of battle and little rest. Lyra followed close behind, sensing that something far worse than anything before was waiting ahead. They reached a canyon where jagged rocks rose high on both sides, and the path narrowed into a strip of cracked earth. The air was thick and heavy, and the ground carried faint tremors, as if the land itself warned them to turn back. Lyra whispered that they should find another way, but the man shook his head, saying in his calm voice that the beasts would hunt them no matter the path, and here at least they could face what came head-on. His eyes did not waver, though she saw the exhaustion that lined his face. He had been bleeding since the last fight, but he carried himself with the same fire as always. The tremors grew stronger, and then the roar came. It was unlike any sound Lyra had heard before, deeper than thunder, louder than the storms of her world. It shook her bones and made the canyon walls tremble. Dust fell from the cliffs, and the sky seemed to darken further as the source of the sound emerged. From the shadows came a beast far greater than the others. Its body towered above the rocks, its scales thick as stone, and its head crowned with jagged horns that glowed faintly with a sickly red light. Its claws dug trenches into the ground with every step, and its eyes burned with a hunger that promised no escape. Lyra felt her knees weaken. She could not breathe as she looked upon the creature. For the first time since meeting the human, she believed death was certain. Even he seemed frozen for a moment, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the weapon harder than before. Then slowly he stepped forward, placing himself between Lyra and the monster. His voice was low but steady. "Stay behind me," he said. She wanted to cry out to stop him, but the words would not leave her throat. The beast charged with a roar that split the air, and the ground quaked beneath its massive form. The human moved to the side, just as the creature struck its claws, ripping through stone. Where he had stood, he swung his weapon, and light flared, striking the beast's shoulder, but it barely flinched. The glow of the weapon flickered weakly, its power nearly gone. Lyra realized with terror that even with all his strength, he might not defeat. This enemy, she felt the weight of helplessness press down upon her, but at the same time, she knew she could not stand idle, not now, not after all he had done. Human dodged again, rolling across the earth as the beast's tail swept past, shattering boulders into dust. He struck again and again, forcing the monster to turn its massive head, but each blow only slowed it. The air filled with the crash of stone, the roar of the beast, and the crackling energy of the fading weapon. Lyra shouted warnings whenever the creature's claws rose behind him, and once he spun just in time to avoid being crushed. Her cries became part of the fight, guiding him as his body grew slower. The battle raged on until the man stumbled, falling to one knee, his weapon dimmed, and the beast loomed above, ready to strike the final blow. Lyra felt a scream tear from her chest. She could not allow him to die, not after he had carried her through every danger, not after he had shown her that hope was possible. She grabbed a sharp shard of rock from the ground, and with trembling hands, she hurled it at the beast's eye. The stone struck true, and the monster roared in fury, turning its head toward her. The human seized that moment with a cry that carried every ounce of his will. He leapt forward, driving his weapon deep into the creature's neck. Light exploded from the strike, the weapon flaring with its last breath of energy. The beast thrashed its roar, shaking the canyon walls. It swung its massive body, throwing the man violently against the rocks. He struck the ground with a heavy thud, blood streaking across his face, yet his hands did not release the weapon. Still lodged in the beast's throat, the weapon pulsed once more, and then shattered in a burst of light. The monster staggered, its roar broke into a choking cry, and at last it collapsed, shaking the earth as it fell. Dust rose high, covering the sky in a gray haze. Silence followed, broken only by the ragged sound of Lyra's breathing. She ran to the human who lay broken and bleeding against the stones. His eyes were half closed, his chest rising shallowly, but he was alive. She knelt beside him, tears streaking her face as she whispered his name, though she did not know if he even heard her. He forced his eyes open long enough to speak in a voice weak but unyielding. "I told you survival is possible if you never stop fighting." Lyra pressed her hands against his wounds, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. Her heart pounded with fear, yet she refused to let despair take her. She whispered again and again that he would not die, that she would not let him die. Around them the fallen beast lay still, its body a mountain of flesh and scale, proof of the battle they had survived. The canyon that had seemed a place of death only moments before now stood as the grave of the greatest predator she had ever seen. The human coughed weakly, but his lips curved into the faintest smile. He had given everything, and more yet. His spirit still burned within him. Lyra saw it in his eyes, even as his body trembled. That fire that refused to bow to death itself was still there, and it gave her strength. She tore strips from her clothing, binding his wounds as best she could. Her hands were clumsy but steady, driven by the will he had awakened in her. As the storm clouds above began to break, letting thin rays of light shine through, Lyra lifted her gaze and whispered that he had changed everything. He had faced the beast that no one could face, and he had done it not for himself alone, but for her. Without him she would have been nothing but bones in the wild. Yet now she knelt beside him, alive, breathing, and determined. She vowed then that she would not let this end here. She would carry him to safety. She would fight for him as he had fought for her. The canyon lay silent, except for the faint sound of the human's breathing and the rustle of wind through the stones. The greatest danger had passed, but the struggle was not over. Ahead lay the long path back to safety, through a world that would never cease to test them. But Lyra no longer felt the weight of helplessness. She felt the strength of choice, the strength of hope given to her by a man who had refused to surrender. And as she pressed her hand against his chest, feeling the faint rhythm of his heart, she whispered to herself that survival was no longer a dream. It was a promise she would keep. The storm faded into a soft hush as the first light of dawn stretched across the sky, painting the jagged cliffs in gold and crimson. Lyra sat beside the wounded human, her hands pressed firmly against the makeshift bindings she had tied across his body. Through the long hours of night she had not allowed herself to sleep, her ears sharp for every sound, and her eyes locked on his chest, rising and falling with fragile rhythm. Each breath he took was a victory, and she whispered to herself again and again that he would not die here, not after all he had endured, not after all he had given. When the sun finally broke fully over the horizon, she rose to her feet, her body aching, but her will strong. She slid her arms beneath his shoulders and pulled with all her strength. He was heavy, and her body was not built for such weight, yet she refused to let go. Step by step she dragged him from the shadow of the fallen beast across the canyon floor toward the forest. She stumbled and fell more than once, her knees scraping against the rocks, but each time she rose again, for every time she faltered, she remembered his voice telling her that survival was possible only when one never stopped fighting. The forest seemed less menacing now, though the cries of unseen creatures still echoed in the distance. Perhaps it was only her mind, but the shadows felt less suffocating, the paths less hopeless. As she moved through the undergrowth, carrying him across her shoulders, she began to understand that the fire he carried was no longer his alone. It had spread into her heart, burning with determination to see them both through this place. Hours past, the sun climbed high, and still she pressed forward, stopping only to give him water or adjust the bindings around his wounds. His eyes opened now and then, hazy and weak, but when he looked at her, she saw the faintest glimmer of the strength that had carried him this far. She spoke to him whenever he stirred, telling him that he had saved her, telling him that she owed him everything, telling him that he had shown her a truth greater than fear. He did not answer with many words, but his gaze softened each time, and that was enough to keep her moving. Evening, they reached the edge of the forest where the land opened into rolling plains. A thin river shimmered in the fading light, and beyond it rose the faint outline of distant settlements, small lights flickering like stars against the earth. Lyra's heart swelled with relief. She knew that her people had cast her out, and they would not welcome her return, but she no longer cared. The sight of safety, even if far away, meant hope for his survival, and that was all she needed. She built a small shelter near the river, gathering branches and weaving them together as best she could. Her hands worked clumsily, yet steadily driven by the need to shield him from the cold night. She laid him upon a bed of leaves and covered him with her cloak, then sat beside him, her body leaning against his as if to share her warmth. The river whispered softly nearby, and for the first time since her exile, she allowed herself to breathe without fear chasing her every thought. As darkness fell, he opened his eyes again, and his lips moved, though his voice was faint. "You should leave me," he said. "I will only slow you down." She shook her head, fiercely refusing his words. Her voice trembled, yet carried strength. "You saved me when you had no reason. You fought for me when I was ready to give up. I will not leave you behind." She pressed her hand to his chest, feeling the slow beat of his heart, and whispered, "You changed everything for me, and now I will change everything for you." Closed his eyes, but a faint smile touched his lips. Silence stretched between them, not empty, but filled with meaning stronger than any words. She knew then that he understood that her will was as unbreakable as his had been, and that they would not part no matter the cost. Days that followed were hard, yet filled with new strength. Together they moved slowly toward the settlements. She carried him when his legs failed, and he guided her when dangers approached. His knowledge of the land, his instinct for survival, never left him even in weakness, and her determination never allowed him to fall. Their bond grew with every step, forged not by blood or by shared history, but by battle and sacrifice and the unyielding fire of survival. When at last they reached the outskirts of the settlement, the guards who watched from the walls stared in disbelief, a human battered and bleeding, leaning upon an alien girl who had once been cast out. They whispered to each other, unsure whether to open the gates. Yet, when they saw the way she held him, the way she refused to falter, they allowed them passage within the walls. Healers rushed forward, taking him from her arms and carrying him to safety. Lyra followed close behind her heart, refusing to calm until she knew he was safe. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the human strength returned. The wounds healed, though scars remained. Across his skin, he rose from the bed with the same fire in his eyes, though softer, now tempered by survival. Lyra never left his side, and in that time her people, who had once abandoned her, began to see her differently. They saw the courage she carried, the will she had learned, and the bond she shared with the man who had faced death for her. Whispers spread that perhaps they had been wrong. Perhaps strength was not only in power or numbers, but in the spirit to stand when no hope remained. When the human could finally walk on his own, he stood beside Lyra before the people of the settlement. His voice carried steady and strong. He spoke of survival, of refusing to surrender, of standing together, even against the wildest beasts of this world. His words struck deep, and many listened with open hearts. Lyra looked at him, then her chest swelling with pride, for she knew he was not just a human, not just a stranger who had saved her life. He was the one who had changed her forever. And when night fell and the stars lit the sky, she sat beside him outside the settlement walls. The air was calm and cool, and for the first time since her exile, she felt no fear. She turned to him, her voice soft but certain. "You gave me back my life," she said. "I will never forget." He looked at her with that same fire still burning in his eyes, and answered, "You gave me a reason to fight. That is something I will never forget." The silence that followed was warm and whole, and Lyra knew the journey was complete. The beasts of the wild had not taken her life, the despair of exile had not broken her. Instead, she had found strength in a human who had stood where no one else dared. Together, they had survived, and in doing so, they had proved that courage was not bound by race or world, but by the will to rise against death itself. And so their story ended not in fear or in loss, but in survival, in hope, and in the unbreakable truth that one human had indeed changed everything.